Every day, we hear a great variety of sounds. Speaking voices, the noise of car engines, the sound of doors opening and closing, of footsteps and of rain, and of music. In other words, we live our lives surrounded by sound. However, sound isn't something we can see with our eyes. So what is this thing called sound? Many of you will remember that during physics lessons in school, we learned that sound is a vibration. But what does that mean? Taking the sound of a bell as an example, we will try to pursue the actual reality of sound as it is produced and as it is heard by our ears. So what is this thing called sound?
Yeah, what is this thing called sound? Well, hey there, it's your old pal Keith from wavetables.lol. That's wavetables.lol, home of KRC Math Waves, my enormous collection of wavetables, single-cycle waveforms, and even some samples for all sorts of modern instruments. And what I wanted to talk about today is to go back in time a little bit to the year 1984, when I was first learning about synthesis. And my first professional-ish synthesizer was the much beloved CZ-101 from Casio Corporation, maker of all sorts of electronic gadgets. And the CZ-101 was a fully digital synth. We are hearing a recreation of it with a plugin called Virtual CZ. That's actually quite a bargain. It's like only $19 now, available from PluginBoutique, like it says in the display there. And this is a pretty faithful emulation of that digital synth. Now, one thing that's super interesting about the CZ-101 is that with digital synthesis being completely new, that synthesizer shipped with a really great manual. In fact, two really great manuals, and I wanted to share them with you today, and talk about some of the great ideas that are found within these manuals. So I guess this is a RTFM episode of our Talkie Synthesizer content show, where we're gonna read the fucking manual. It's gonna be more exciting than it sounds, okay? So hold on, we'll be right back. Besides the percussion, all of the sounds that you heard in the little intro groove were made with Virtual CZ, which I do find has a very convincing emulation of the Casio CZ-101. And what did I want to do here? I'm having a lot of latency, so I need to take off this UAD mastering processor. There we go. So there's like this kind of pad-like sound that's sort of sawtoothy. There's this one, which I think is using the fairy tale patch. Let's see. Yeah, I really like this sound. As you probably know, if you've watched my videos, I love bell-like timbres, which is why I spend so much time generating wavetables that do unique approaches to this kind of sound. It does cool basses. Let's see, and then there's like a sweep kind of thing. A very interesting little synthesizer, and even though it doesn't have, filters, because we couldn't model filters digitally very well yet in the early 80s, this synthesizer uses a very interesting technique that we'll get to that actually ties in with the discussion of waveshaping in my last video. So what are these manuals that I speak of? Well, let's see. Here we go. Um, there are actually two manuals that like shipped with the CZ-101. Just your typical user manual. Hold on. Let's zoom out. And what I did is I found the best scans of these that I could find on the internet. They're not super great, but I did OCR them, and so they are searchable. This is what the CZ-101 looked like, at least in like diagrammatic form. It had like a mini keyboard. It's 4 octaves. It had guitar strap pegs on it, so you could strap it on like a guitar if you're a really big geek. I may have had a hot pink guitar strap on my CZ-101. I'm not saying I did, but I might have. It was really cool, and there's a little bit of menu diving in it, but it's kind of like button per function. Like everything's like really well laid out. And in addition to the operation manual, something that is more interesting to me is it came with this extra book. And let's just go back to the first page. And don't have it behind your head, Keith. I'm also backlit today. I'm sorry. Once again, it's wintertime and the sun is low in the sky and it's bouncing off the building behind me. And it's my halo. Okay, so just if you see some light creeping through, it's just because I'm beatific. So it came with a second book called the Sound Synthesis Handbook that's actually really cool. And this book was incredibly influential to me when I was learning synthesis. Before getting the CZ-101, I had things like Yamaha PSRs, pre-programmed electronic instruments that were kind of fun in their own right. But you couldn't really modify the sounds in much of a meaningful way. Um, so it was really helpful to have this book that actually explains sound synthesis, and it has kind of a tutorial approach. Like it takes you through and says, hey, let's create some sounds. But it also stresses that if you're completely new to synthesis, you should go read the appendix, which is called Synthesizer Sound Seminar. And the text that I was speaking in the intro it's the introduction, like to that section. And I have to say, like this appendix and also the manual in its entirety was extremely helpful to me and extremely influential to me in the way that I think about synthesis. It's like always come back to these sort of core ideas. And so I wanted to talk through a few of them. I wanted to share this book with you, which is available via a Google Drive link. Links in the description. There's always links in the description, so that you can read it too. And I think even advanced synthesists, not just beginners, would find value in this. It's very interesting. So the Synthesizer Sound Seminar starts with, maybe I'll make this really big. It starts with this intro that basically just talks about what is sound and explains, that sound is vibration in the air, right? And then it goes on to explain how we can visualize sound waves, right? By charting them like this or showing them on an oscilloscope, and then talks about the three basic elements of sound. So, the three basic elements of sound, right, are pitch, like what is the frequency of the sound, its volume, and then its tone quality, which is something that I call timbre, right? But if you've never thought about sound, you don't know that. And then it's very simple, but it explains what is pitch, what is frequency, how does that work? And then it talks about amplitude, sound volume, right? And just basically explains what that is. It goes on to talk about tone color, or what I would call timbre, and it in a very natural way kind of explains how the basic synthesis waveforms map to real world acoustic instruments, right? So here on this page it's talking about how the sine wave, which only has the fundamental, it describes the tone color as being soft. I guess that's true. We might also call it pure. And instruments that that are mostly like the sine wave, right? Flutes, whistles, right? And then the sawtooth wave, it has a tone color or a timbre that's bright. That's true. In a more detailed fashion, which it'll get into in this book. We would talk about the harmonic content of the sawtooth wave, but it's basically bright. And violins and trumpets sort of produce this waveform, the sawtooth. The square wave description is kind of strange. It calls it simple. I think somewhere else it calls it describes it as having an open sound. But it is true that the square wave resembles the sound of reed instruments, right? Like the clarinet and oboe, as mentioned here. This booklet goes on to actually explain, it doesn't use the term fast Fourier transform or anything, or it doesn't really mention Fourier, but it does talk about how the sawtooth wave has like all harmonics falling off in a certain way. The square wave only has odd harmonics, right? And it talks about how we could sum two sine waves to get something that approaches a sawtooth wave. It talks about noise. It talks about the pure tone of the sine wave. It's very interesting. And it's actually one of the most concise descriptions of these concepts that I've ever seen. And it's very easy to get to grips with. So like if you're new to synthesis, like just go grab this book and start reading it. It's because it's really helpful. It goes on to explain envelopes, right? And how the amplitude envelope of various acoustic instruments, it might vary. And then, because you might not be familiar with, you're definitely in 1984 not very familiar with digital synthesis, but you might not even be aware of how analog synthesizers work. It talks about the basic structure there and explains VCOs, the voltage-controlled oscillators, voltage-controlled filters, VCAs, the voltage-controlled amplifier, what an envelope generator is, and then LFOs. Again, in this very succinct and like easy to understand way. It's super cool. Let's see. As it goes on, then it gets into the analogs. I don't mean that in the sense of analog electronics, but I mean that in the sense of like the metaphors that the CZ-101 and its sibling synthesizers have. And you can see that the approach here was there's a digitally controlled oscillator. There's something called a DCW, a digitally controlled wave that actually controls timbre. And then there's a digitally controlled amplifier. And you can see that there's envelope generators attached to all three of those blocks. And then there's a digital LFO that can modulate pitch. So, and then it points you to another section of the manual to understand that better. So that's really cool, right? It's just like this great little summary of like, how does sound work? How does synthesis work? And then having consumed that, the rest of this guide, which, if you had virtual CZ or you had a CZ-101, you could actually try out these exact things. But there's a lot of really interesting concepts that are explained in here. And, it talks about like how to use the synth. But then also there are sections that talk about in modifying a given patch, like what is happening when you're changing a specific envelope. And this is really interesting. The envelopes in the CZ-101 and also in virtual CZ, can we still hear it? Yeah. The envelopes have 8 stages, which is super interesting. Let's see if we can find a diagram that shows that a little bit better. Yeah, so there's one right here. Let's see. That's maybe not the best one. We'll get there. Here we go. And so again, we've got a little deeper comparison between like the structure of an analog synthesizer and the structure of the CZ series. Talks a little bit more about those. And then we get into like detune and the fact that there are actually 2 complete voices in this synthesizer. So we've got like they're called lines in the CZ nomenclature. Line 1 and line 2, they can be detuned with respect to each other. Let's see. There's another kind of block diagram. And then part 3 is super interesting. So this is the part I think that kind of sticks with me. and that I'm always kind of thinking about in my head when I'm creating new patches. So tips for sound synthesis, effective techniques. Um, this is really cool. It talks about the 8 different waveforms that the CZ can create, um, which is kind of nice. And then it goes on to, these are kind of examples and also sort of inspirations. So it explains, like, for the pitch envelope, some experiments that you could do, like making a percussive attack. And you know, we might not today um, think a lot about like pitch modulation. In like chord multipoly, there's a dedicated pitch envelope. But I have to say, going back to this manual and reading it again just kind of reminded me, like, oh yeah, like there's a lot that you can do to inform the attack of a patch using pitch envelopes. And so there's a percussive attack example. There's an example of using auto glide here. So while the CZ has portamento, you can also like glide into a note, right? By like starting with the pitch down and then, kind of sweeping into it. And when you explore techniques like that, you'll discover all sorts of really interesting effects that you can get with any synth, either by gliding up into the pitch or by gliding down. Gliding up is actually kind of a vocal effect that's really cool. I talked about in my original overview of chord multipoly about a little trick that I do is sort of this percussive attack, like on a plucked string sound. I'll put a very tiny and very fast, like, pitch modulation swoop down, and that really helps sell the effect of a plucked string instrument. There's also, like, I don't find this particular example actually to be super realistic, but there's this really funny mention here again using the 8 stage envelopes of the CZ-101. It says, hey, if you take pitch and you modulate it very rapidly in this triangular way over the course of an octave, it'll sound like the attack of a distortion guitar, like an electric guitar under distortion. And we'll look at that with a practical example in Modwave, and we'll see if we can recreate this, even though we don't have 8 stage pitch envelope in Modwave. That'll be fun. And then it talks about, if you do this kind of modulation on the DCW, which is the equivalent of the filter in an analog synth, you can create a wah-wah sound. So all of these things, you can imagine me as, like, I don't know, like a 14-year-old kid, like trying all these things and exploring this stuff for the first time. And but if you follow these examples and you do these things, like, you will actually advance your ability to synthesize better sounds and like make better patches and maybe even make more interesting music. So really, really cool stuff. This is kind of the diagram I was looking for. You can see here in this example of the digitally controlled amplifier envelope in CZ, you can see the 8 stage structure. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that you can make it so that there's an after effect. So after the key goes off, right, on key up, you can make ramps that like go down and then come back up again. In 1984, like, there weren't many like reasonably priced effects, right? So this was a way of doing like a digital delay type of effect, right? It's fake delay. You get these 2 pulses like after the key goes off, and I used that a lot in my own explorations. The other thing that's kind of cool with these envelopes is that all the stages are linear, but since you've got 8 of them, like, you can really nuance the shapes, right? So, in a modern synthesizer, like we'll see in Modwave, I'll try to remember to show this. You've got the attack and the decay and the release. They can have different types of shapes, right? So you can go from linear to like an exponential rise or attack, in those kind of envelopes. And then the decay can go from linear, in attacks, I meant to say that they go, from linear to more of a logarithmic, like a faster ramp. And then decays, you can go from linear to like more of an exponential decay. The cool thing about these multi-stage envelopes in the CZ series is that you could use those linear segments to, approximate these shapes. So you could have like a, slow rise that then gets faster using two segments. And you could have a release that goes quickly and then is really long. And we could sort of, emulate reverb with that. So lots of interesting things that are explained when you read this. Other things, and actually this little tip is actually very, very effective if you have it. I don't want to be in the way of it. Hopefully I'm not in the way of it. But using the multi-stage envelopes, you could do an attack like this that has like two bumps in it. And that really does sound like the tonguing effect on brass wind instruments, like in trumpets and stuff. And it's pretty convincing. Very interesting thing to explore. We could probably simulate this with an LFO that's enveloped in a modern synthesizer, or there are synths out there that have multi-stage envelopes, right? And so this just gives you like a lot of guidance and a lot of like cool ideas to try out with envelopes like that. Another thing that I think is pretty cool is the next page. There's a chart of what detune would do. And so there's a lot of different ideas here, like how to make organ sounds, what harmonics are in accentuated by different settings on detune. And I find this pretty interesting. In these higher detune settings, they talk about how like the 2 octaves up, 3 notes up, 48 cents up accentuates the fifth harmonics, but they call this the sound of hitting wood. And then as we go higher and higher, we get to like the sound of hitting glass and then more metallic sounds. And that's a really interesting way to think about the pitch offset of different oscillators, right? And it's like this little chart, like just stuck in my mind kind of forever. There are some errors in it, like this one. So the 7th harmonics, it says is 3 octaves up. That will not accentuate 7th harmonics. That's clearly a misprint, because 3 octaves up would, it accentuates the harmonics that are 3 octaves above the other pitch. So, little errors aside, it's very interesting. Goes on to explain ring modulation, how ring modulation in the CZ series will create a new waveform that has different harmonics from the 2 input waveforms, etc. Let's see. This doesn't have, okay. So that's this book. It's a great little book. Go read it. I mean, I'm giving you a link for free. This is no longer in print. But it's really great. Just go and read it. And there's surely something interesting that it'll spark in your mind as you think about synthesis. Now, back to the Casio CZ-101 manual itself. There are a couple of interesting features in this synthesizer that remind us about really important modulations. First, the CZ-101 doesn't have any sort of modulation matrix to speak of. It instead, like every modulation is hard-coded, but they're well selected. And they mimic like the classic, what we today call East Coast synthesizer architecture. 2 of these that I think are very interesting, and they're there, so we tend to use them, are the DCW key follow feature. So again, the DCW is sort of like the filter control in the CZ-101, and there's a DCW key follow parameter that can be used to make the waveform softer the further up the keyboard we go. And so that's a lot like filter tracking in an analog synth or in a modern virtual analog synthesizer, that I just don't see people apply very much anymore. Today, again, I'm thinking about the Korg R&D synths here, but they have filter track, and they also have like a filter track ramp that you can control, so you can change the way this, these things go. But acoustic instruments as the pitch goes higher, the waveforms become, less pronounced. They have fewer harmonics. And so DCW key follow was a way of approximating this. And since it's there, like, you tend to use it. It was a very simple system. The amounts range from 0 to 9, and you can see there's these, I guess they're various, kind of exponential curves. Or maybe they're logarithmic curves. I guess they're kind of logarithmic, which would make sense the way that sound works. So filter tracking, again, like a really interesting thing to use and apply in your own patches. And then similarly, while they don't have a diagram for it, there's DCA key follow. So another characteristic, oh, thanks, there's sirens now. You probably won't hear those. Another interesting thing that happens in acoustic instruments is that as we play higher up the keyboard, they tend to not ring out as long, right? And so DCA key follow is another, like, integer number that speeds up the digitally controlled amplifier envelope as you move up the keyboard. And again, since it's available and it's easy to use, we tend to use it. Now, so today, if we wanted to do those kind of things in a more advanced synthesizer, we can do things like we can modulate the rise time or the fall time and the release time, right? The attack, decay, and release of our amplitude envelope. Spit the words out, Keith. Why does this happen at this point in these videos? Anyway, so we could speed those up, and this is another modulation I just don't see people like doing very much anymore. But it's worth exploring. So that's super interesting. And finally, talking about this manual, no discussion of the CZ-101 would be complete without talking about, like, how it actually works. So Casio called this method of synthesis, which we're hearing here, they called it phase distortion. And a lot of times people will say colloquially that phase distortion is like Yamaha's FM, but it is really not. Phase distortion is pretty interesting how it's implemented in the synthesizer. So there's apparently only one waveform that's stored in ROM, and it's a cosine wave. In the charts here in the manual that describe how the synthesis works, they use a sine wave, but the actual source waveform is a cosine wave, which is just a sine wave that's been phase rotated by 90 degrees. We'll see one in the next segment. And so what happens is that this digitally stored cosine wave is read out at different rates to create the 8 different wave shapes. Let's go and look at those real quick. The 8 different wave shapes that are in the CZ-101. They're here. You can see them. They're printed on the front panel here. So there's a sawtooth, there's a square, there's a pulse-like wave. I think this is called double sine, sine saw, and then these kind of resonant waveforms that were made in a slightly different way. But back to the manual. So what they explain is that if we read out this waveform, which must be 8-bit, I assume it's probably 256 samples in length, but it could be shorter even. I haven't seen any definitive information on that. Surely the author of the virtual CZ plugin knows. But if we read this waveform out at a constant rate, we will faithfully reconstruct the waveform. And if we change the rate at which we read the waveform out, so you see here, we're saying that we're going to read the first portion out a little bit faster, and then we're going to go more slowly for the remaining part of the waveform. You see that the waveform distorts in such a way that it starts to become sawtooth-like. And then if we go a very quick readout and then a very slow readout for the last part of the waveform, we get this thing that watchers of my channel who saw my last video about the Waveshaper oscillator in Korg Multipoly, where I kind of showed some diagrams like this that explain how waveshaping works, you will say, hey, Keith, these look exactly like those diagrams you used to explain the transfer functions of a waveshaper. So isn't what this synth is doing waveshaping? And you'd be exactly correct. This is in fact waveshaping. So even though they called this phase distortion, it's really digitally controlled waveshaping. And even though the manual says that DCW is digitally controlled wave, like what they really meant was it's a digitally controlled waveshaper. So this is a really interesting fact, right? It's like clear that the Casio designers of phase distortion synthesis were thinking about waveforms in the time domain and thinking about manipulating them in the time domain and coming up with these algorithms that allowed them to take just one simple waveform and create all these more harmonically diverse waveforms. So this is not like the Yamaha style or the Chowning style FM, as we might call it, which, as people have pointed out, and I'm not going to get into the maths about this today, but that FM, in the way that Yamaha implemented it and the way that Chowning originally described it, is really phase modulation. And it's not true frequency modulation. Okay, whatever. But in the CZ-101, it's like we have a digital wave shaper. So it's very interesting. This presages like later, digital waveform manipulation techniques and even analog waveform manipulation techniques, right? That were being used in West Coast synthesis, where we find things like wave folders and wave shapers. In Casio's case, like this is just like an extreme form of compression, right? So, like memory is super expensive. The custom ROMs are super expensive. There's little space in them to store stuff. And so they found a way using wave shaping to, make a single waveform be the source of all these 8 different waveforms that you have. Another interesting thing about this is that you can see that these curves in the figures, right? They're like these linear segments. So they didn't have to store the full wave shaping wave, right? Like, so if we wanted a sawtooth wave and we had room to store it, well, we would just compute a digital sawtooth wave, right, and write it to ROM. But what you can see is that in this case, we can make a sawtooth wave just by knowing 3 points, and we really just need to know one of them. Like, all we need to know is that, so we have a start, and then there's some kind of angle, for this line, this section of the ramp, right, that we can express as a phase angle. But you could also call it a time angle. Like when I look at these things, like I kind of see them as time vectors, right? Like this we're moving fast, this we're moving slow. So they could have called this like time distortion synthesis or like time dilation synthesis. I think that was a missed marketing opportunity. Or they could have just called it digital wave shaping, right? The fact that they used the term phase, I think confuses a lot of people, but it's just wave shaping, which is really cool. The other point I was making that I did not finish is that you can see that we really only need to store these 3 points. So instead of having, let's say, 256 samples for the shaping curve, well, we can just store these phase angles, right? So this is a steep phase angle, this is a shallow phase angle, and so, we've maybe reduced our sawtooth wave to just like maybe 3 bytes of information, maybe 6. I don't know if you'd need to record the 0 here, and you'd need to record the position, obviously, where the transition changes. But this is a very, very clever companding technique. Now, the other thing that happens with this is that we can change this curve over time, right? Now, we don't get to control that, but Casio does. And so the DCW control goes from these steeper curves. When the DCW value is high, it's going to make the sawtooth wave. But then this point travels back toward the linear ramp that makes for a true reconstruction of the cosine wave, right? And this has the effect of sounding like a filter closing down, because we're going from a waveform with many harmonics back to a waveform that just has one harmonic, right? And so it sounds like this. They have a very distinct swell to them. Let's go back to Bitwig, shall we? So they have a very distinct, sorry, I just tripped over my own chord. They have a very distinct sound to them. So in this patch, which is a string ensemble kind of patch, you can see that if I move the DCW bass up all the way, there's my sawtooth, and then as I modulate this back down, we're much quieter. It's almost like a sine wave. We've also got an envelope that is, let's adjust this so we can see the envelope. This is just kind of like an attack, sustain, release envelope, right? It goes up to maximum and then falls back down after we release the key, and it has this distinct sweep sound that is actually, it's very pleasant, and it's a lot like certain kinds of analog filters. And then it fades away. So super cool and effective, and a very clever approach to memory management in a primitive digital synth. Okay, so that's how phase distortion works. And again, I think they should have called it time distortion, or they could have just called it wave shaping. I don't know. Interesting stuff. Okay, so yeah, I guess there might be other little interesting factoids in here about synthesis that are worth looking at. But I thought it was really worth looking at the DCW key follow idea and the DCA key follow idea, and translating those into modern synthesizer architectures. Okay, let's take a short break, and then let's put one of these ideas. Let's put that distortion guitar pitch modulation idea into practice in a modern synth. We'll use modwave native for that. Okay. So I guess another thing I should point out about these wave shapes is that there are these resonant waves. So you see, like 6 is a sawtooth ramp that has these little wibbles in it, as I like to call them. And let's put it in. Let's see. Yeah, it's just line 1. Let's try. There we go. Let's try Reso 6. There's not a real filter in this synthesizer, right? But there's another trick that it does. So with these Reso waves, the number of the resonant frequency shifts, which I guess are ring modulation or maybe amplitude modulation of that cosine wave, that's then shaped in volume, they change, getting some distortion. They change as the DCW parameter goes up and down. And so they go from this kind of more resonant effect there at the top, right? And release, you'll hear it go, it's a very distinctive sound. And again, these synthesizers did not have effects on them. The CZ-101 did not have a chorus. I think the CZ-1 does have a chorus. That was the full-size keyboard version of the CZ-101. So there's a chorus, and I'm just adding some reverb to this using Air Windows Consolidated, which is entirely free. Go get it. And there's been the author of it has done a ton of new plugins, some really cool new reverbs, a lot of cool new mastering stuff, a new tape emulation, well worth checking out, and nominally entirely free, though you can support the creator Chris via his Patreon. It's just like in the same way you can support me by buying KRC math waves at wavetables.lol. If you use coupon code Sandra or follow the link that's in the description, you can get it for just $20 rather than the $29 that it usually costs. So here we are without any reverb. And here we are without any chorus, I guess. Let's take that off. I mean, still a cool sound, right? All right, so that's kind of the resonant wave idea. Let's leave our friend Bitwig. Bye, Bitwig. And let's try this idea that was suggested in the Casio synthesizer. What is it called? What's it called? It's the Casio Sound Synthesis Handbook. Let's try this idea. That's about I called it the Casio guitar trick. This idea of creating a complex attack. I've already done it in this patch. Go down an octave. It's pretty convincing with chords. All right, how did we do that? Let's see. Mirror. There's another thing I want to talk about, actually. Let's see. Mirror waves 1, maybe? Let's see. Let's go to edit mode so we can actually see this. Here we go. Synthesis. Here are some interesting wavetables, actually. These are not in KRC Mathwaves yet. But these, before we get to the guitar trick thing, these are waveforms that, wavetables that I recently created in response to a question from friend of the channel, SoundAuthor, who does a whole bunch of cool presets for all sorts of other synthesizers and is a neat guy, has a good YouTube channel. There'll be a link in the description. Hey, like and subscribe to my channel for more talky synthesizer content. He had sent me, let's see, he sent me an email with a question. Let's turn off oscillator 1 so we can just hear oscillator 2. He had built a reactor patch that manipulates waveforms and was trying to create a wavetable from them based on this pretty interesting idea. So his patch has a mirror control. And what it does is it takes a source waveform, and in this specific case, it was the cosine wave. Here's the cosine wave again. So it's a sine wave that's phase rotated by 90 degrees. And as the waveform proceeds, it gets mirrored. And so you see what's happening here is we've got the first half of this cosine wave going up, and we just chop off the second part of it, right, which would go this way, and we just flip the first part of the waveform, mirror it around the y-axis. And so you go from this pure tone, I'll have to go a couple octaves up to hear it. That's a sine wave. It goes to this more, it's more harmonically rich, maybe a little bit like a sawtooth. It's kind of like a rounded off sawtooth sound, really. And then as the wave continues to change phase, at the middle point, we will then get the sine wave. And then it proceeds to bend in the opposite direction as it mirrors once again. And then at the very top of the wavetable, now we're back to the cosine wave. Let's turn off our filter. Let's maybe hear what that sounds like if we modulate position. Let's take position and modulate it. Yeah, I've already got it set up with OS2 LFO. If we do this, there we go. Let's make that 50. 50. Okay, so that's going halfway. And if we make this 100, we'll travel the entire wavetable. Let's hear what that sounds like. Pretty interesting. And so he was having some trouble actually making the wavetable such that you fully hit that 2 pi rotation to get to the cosine wave again. There was a little bit of what was probably floating point error. And so I wrote a little script to create this wavetable for him. But I was also like, hey, we can do that with other basic synthesis waves too, and we don't have to use the cosine wave. We could actually start with different offsets. And so, so here's that same version using a triangle wave. Kind of an interesting sound that happens there. And then let's see, there's a version with sawtooth waves. You can see that at certain points it creates this very interesting kind of, it's sort of like pulse width modulation on a sawtooth, right? So I thought that was pretty neat. Let's just let's change this to one of those too. I don't know what I used in my example sort of inspiration patch, but let's just turn us one back on, I guess, Keith, right? All right, here we go. All right, that's a decent enough starting place. Now, let's try to do this trick and hear what it sounds like if we modulate the pitch of our tuning very quickly. And we don't have a multi-stage envelope like in the CZ-101, right? But we do have LFOs that can go pretty fast. So let's take our pitch LFO. Let's make it as fast as we can make it. Like, I don't know, maybe not quite as fast as we can make it. Let's do like 31 hertz or something. Sure, 31, that sounds like a good number. Now, if we were to assign this to our tune parameter, we start to hear this. Well, that's pretty wild. Let's set it to a maximum of 6 so that we're going 6 semitones up and 6 semitones down, which I think was the recipe that no, it's like fart noise now. But of course we don't want to sustain this. We want to roll this off. So what we're going to do is we'll modulate the pitch LFO intensity with some other thing, maybe an envelope, eh? Let's see, set this back to 6. Come on. Why can't I type today? Okay, we'll set that to 6. And then what we'll do, actually, we're not going to use this built-in one because we can't scale it. So we're going to add this again. So we'll add pitch LFO, generator, pitch LFO, and let's scale it by, I don't know, should we use we could just use OS2 envelope. How about that? OS2 envelope. All right. So we'll set this to 6. All right. And then OS2 envelope, what shape is that? Aha. So you see that pitch modulation dies down after a while, but we're not going fast enough. We want it to be pretty quick. There we are. We're just barely hearing it now. It's still a little bit trumpety, but that's interesting itself, right? We want it to be pretty fast. All right, now let's try to sell the effect a little bit, right? I mean, that kind of works. It's still not exactly working. All right, let's add some effects appropriate for an electric guitar, right? So we'll go to our pre-effects. Let's use guitar amp. Which preset do I want? 8 80s T75. What does that guy sound like? Oh, yeah. You know, maybe this deserves some other effects. Do we want like a little flanger on there maybe? Yeah. And I guess we have our, maybe not quite so much reverb, eh? I would say that mostly works. Now, of course, we can sell that effect like much more. Let's go back to our original inspiration patch. I'm not gonna sit here for an hour and like remake this, right? But some of the other ideas that we might try here is like put a guitar style pitch modulation with LFO on it. So you'll see with my tune parameter, I've got a modulation here where the pitch LFO is being scaled by mod wheel CC. It's just like a semitone. So and let's look at that pitch LFO. In the pitch LFO, I'm using the guitar shape. So this is an LFO shape that only goes up. So this is kind of like you know, like actual guitar string bending would do. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm modulating the frequency up. So it starts at about 4.6 hertz, and then I've got it scaled with the mod wheel by a small amount, by 1.3. And so what happens is as we increase the vibrato, it actually goes up in speed. This is a thing that humans do. And it wouldn't be an episode without fat fingers, would it? And all of a sudden, you could put a pink jacket on me and call me Jan Hammer. Pretty cool. So lots of neat stuff you can do there. The other thing I did in this patch when I got more sophisticated with it is that as I did use key tracking to reduce the amount of this fast modulation on the pitch. So as we play higher up, you can't really see it. There's less of an effect. And the way that I did that is, let's see, in tune, I moved this the pitch LFO, or sorry, in this case it's the filter LFO that's going really fast. I moved that to a mod processor. So in mod processor 1, what I'm doing is I'm sending that filter LFO and I'm scaling it by OS2 envelope so that I can again scale it with the key tracker. So you'll see here, this mod process 1 is now being scaled by amp key track. And if you look at the output of mod processor 1, you'll see that it's just this little pulse of very fast moving LFO. See it? You can barely see it because it's so short. But I wanted it to decrease as we go up the keyboard, so I scale that output of the mod processor by amp key track, and here's how I set that up. So you see it's the full effect lower on the keyboard. But then as they get higher, we start to reduce it. Because it's a very strong and audible effect in the higher registers. Ow! And it's most realistic kind of in the middle octaves. You know, every synthesizer programmer is a frustrated guitar player, right? All right, so as I mentioned, there will be links in the description to these very interesting manuals for the CZ-101. I'll also link to Virtual CZ, which again is a very affordable VST. It's kind of fun if you want to play around. You actually want to follow along with these ideas exactly as they're presented. It's a one-for-one recreation of the interface on the original CZ-101, with some nice little additions, like a chorus, and so there's a couple other cool features in there. But it's easy to get to grips with. Have fun. Think about modulations. Maybe in a future video, I'll talk about another really influential book for me. Because there's not a whole ton, or at least in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't a whole ton of written material besides periodicals about sound design and synthesis. And so there is a really interesting, it's a textbook, but it's Curtis Rhodes' The Computer Music Tutorial, which felt like manna from heaven when it was originally published in like 1996. And I was working with the Nord Modular a lot. It gave me tons of ideas for like things to try. Today it might be a little less relevant, but he did update it. There's a second edition that came out in 2023. Unfortunately, it's pretty expensive, and it's like $77 even as a Kindle. Because it's priced like a textbook. But I am thinking about getting that and rereading a lot of it. And so maybe we'll cover that book. Let me know in the comments if you want me to discuss synthesizer books. I hope you found this interesting. Be well, and I will talk to you later.